Hi, so today we're starting Chapter 8, which is all about the Federalist era, and you'll learn more about what that is as we progress in the chapter. But we are going to be covering pages 116 to 121 today. So the Federalist era lasts from 1789 to 1800. Okay, so let's pause for a moment. In President Washington's farewell address, which is some years down the road for Washington, because he did serve twice as president. We just had him elected. But in his farewell address, he says, "The government, the offspring of your own choice, adopted upon full investigation and mature deliberation, completely free in its principles and containing within itself a provision for its own amendments, has a just claim to your confidence and respect." So he's talking about this new government that has been established in America. And he's saying that this government is something that has the ability to make the country succeed. So for your assignment today, you're going to listen to this lecture, and you're also going to answer these questions based upon that quote that I just read. If you need to look at the quote again, you can look on page 116 of your book. It's in the first column. It's in italics. You'll be able to see it. So on a piece of paper, or you can type it and then share it with me. And or rather, what will be best, of course, is uploading it to Dropbox, which there will be an option for that. But I want you to answer these three questions. Why was the government the offspring of your own choice? Why did Washington believe our government was worthy of our confidence and respect? And why do you think Washington included these remarks in his farewell address? Okay, so that's what you're going to turn into me today. Okay, so let's get down to pages 116 to 121. So the United States launched her new constitutional government amid perilous times. There were domestic problems, there were foreign affair problems, and really America was starting an experiment in government that she had really not a lot of examples to follow. If you look at Europe, there was a lot of monarchies historically, but there has not really been any democracies. And FYI, America is not a democracy. Technically, it's a constitutional republic. But the concept of democracy is very important to the United States. And so in this new age, many Americans had doubt about how the country was going to prosper and how it was going to succeed. But fortunately, there are men of vision like George Washington, like John Knox, like Alexander Hamilton, like Thomas Jefferson, who were men of vision and foresaw that a great nation was in the making. And able leaders and determined citizens would help make that vision that they foresaw a reality. So a new government is launched. It's launched amidst Washington's inauguration. He's, of course, the first president of the United States, and he has a lot of responsibility on his shoulders because it's going to be a most urgent task of the new Congress to create the executive department that was laid out, of course, in the Constitution. And they're also going to need to develop some different departments within the executive departments to help further things along as far as within the government itself. So Washington's inauguration, he arrived in New York City, which was the temporary capital, and his ceremony is not all that everyone imagined it would be because it was delayed due to bad weather, and a lot of the times people, because of bad weather, could not travel, and so the ceremony had to be delayed until April. And many people saw this delay and these problems as an omen, a bad omen for the new republic. So with his hand on the Bible, Washington took the oath of office, adding the words, "So help me God." So what's cool about Washington is he's known as the Precedent President, and because of the fact that he took the oath and then added the words, "So help me God." all the other presidents followed that example. So he was the president who set lots of examples for us later as a nation. This is, of course, where the inauguration took place, and you can see that it looks a lot different now, of course, because there are cars, but that building is where the spot where he took his oath. Okay, so Thomas Jefferson once referred to George Washington as the best horseman of his age and the most graceful figure that could be seen on horseback. And this really captures a lot of the admiration that Americans in general felt for Washington. It's really no wonder that he's called the father of our country, because God graced him to be a leader in very difficult, unique times, and God gave him wisdom for how to conduct himself. Like I said earlier, he was known as the Precedent President, but there you can see that it's actually spelled out there, so you know what it is. A precedent is like an example that one follows. It's the first kind of example that one follows later. So I mentioned earlier that the most urgent task of Congress was to create executive departments. It created the Department of State, which later became the Department of the Department of State was originally called the Department of Foreign Affairs, but then they changed it to Department of State. The new government created the Department of the Treasury and the War Department, which we call today the Department of Defense. The Congress also created the Office of Attorney General for legal affairs of government and Postmaster General to oversee post office and post roads. So there's a few notable names here that got appointed to important offices in these departments. Thomas Jefferson was appointed the first Secretary of State, Alexander Hamilton as the first Secretary of the Treasurer, Henry Knox, Secretary of War, Edmund Randolph as Attorney General, and Samuel Osgood as Postmaster General. And Washington began the tradition of the president's cabinet, and really what he was doing was he was merely continuing what he did as a military leader, which was asking for multiple opinions and then making a decision from there. And that's basically what the president's cabinet is for, is to give the president opinions and information so that he can make a more informed decision. And it was a very good idea that President George Washington established, and it's one, of course, that we still have today. Washington's cabinet was really the dream team. There has never been a cabinet as competent as Washington's cabinet. So it was Knox, Hamilton, Jefferson, and Randolph who made up his cabinet. So it's important to know that Congress also passed the Judiciary Act of 1789, which set up a federal court system as outlined in the Constitution. And this provided for a Supreme Court with a Chief Justice and 5 Associate Justices, and for federal district and circuit courts. And then, of course, John Jay was the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Okay, so we got to talk about Hamilton's financial plan, because America, as a new nation, was deep in debt, and one of the most urgent problems Washington was facing and his administration was facing was the payment of national debt. So without sound financial structure, the new government could not hope to gain the respect of either of its own citizens and foreign nations, because of the fact that if someone doesn't pay their debts, then no one's going to trust them. And the same thing is true for a country. If a country doesn't pay its debts, then no one's really going to respect or trust them. So a man by the name of Alexander Hamilton is given the task of rebuilding the nation's financial structure. And he devises a bold and far-reaching plan to set America on sound financial footing, and he presents his plan to Congress in a series of reports. So this is what he basically decides is going to be best for the country. He knew that in order for the government to prove its integrity, they needed to pay their debts. So he divided the nation's debts into 3 categories: payment of the foreign debt, which everybody agreed that needed to be paid off; payment of the domestic debt, which came about because of the fact that many private citizens had loaned money during the American Revolution to help finance the war, and they needed, the money returned to them. They need their debts paid. And also, soldiers had accepted pay certificates instead of paychecks in hopes that, and in the trust that they would be paid later at a later time. So it's important to pay the people who fought in the war and the people who financed the war. And then the third kind of debt was the state debt. Each individual state had incurred debt during the war, and so Alexander Hamilton proposes that the national government assumes the debt from the states and makes it a national debt instead. So obviously, the government could not afford to pay its debts immediately. As you saw, that was a lot of money: $40 million, $12 million, $21 million. That's a lot. So Hamilton creates a plan for raising revenue in the future. But for the present, Hamilton recommends that Congress exchange the old bonds and certificates for new interest-bearing bonds to be paid back in full over a period of 15 to 20 years. And this part of Alexander Hamilton's plan was called funding the debt. So Hamilton, as I said, presents these ideas to Congress in a series of reports, and Hamilton's ideas are eventually adopted. Like I said earlier, foreign debt was not objected to. Everyone believed that they needed to pay the domestic debt, the foreign debt off, but paying back the domestic debt caused an outcry. And this is because a lot of people who had certificates and bonds given to them sold theirs to speculators. Some of them only got 10 cents on the dollar because they thought, well, some money is better than no money. But when they heard about the fact that the government was planning on paying back or redeeming the bonds and the certificates in full, then the people who had sold them felt like that they were missing out and that they got the short end of the stick. But Hamilton argues that speculators deserved to profit. They were the ones who had purchased the bonds and certificates anyway, so they deserved to profit from it. And then, of course, farmers and working men were upset at this idea of the bonds and the domestic debt being paid back because of the fact that they were getting this idea that the money would come from them because it would come through taxes and they would just be benefiting people who are already rich, and that didn't seem fair to them. But Congress does adopt Hamilton's ideas, and most businessmen agreed with Hamilton and realized that what he was proposing was going to help the nation as a whole in the long run, and it would help establish a sound economy. So the greatest controversy of Hamilton's proposals is that he wanted the federal government to assume the state debts, and this was a controversy because northern states approved of their war debts being assumed by the national government because they had war debts, but the southern states disapproved because they had mostly already paid off their war debts, and so they felt like they were not going to be getting anything out of this deal because they had already started to pay their debts back, and it didn't look fair for the people who had not done that, the states who had not done that. And so Hamilton points out that although the states had individually incurred debts, it had been for the good of the nation as a whole. And so there was a putting aside of the individual states and looking at the nation as a whole, as the United States. And in order to win his perspective, in order for Hamilton's perspective to win out, Hamilton made a political deal with Thomas Jefferson regarding the location of the nation's capital. So in order for the plan to be adopted, Hamilton's plan to be adopted, Hamilton and Jefferson made an agreement that for 10 years